1809. As Europe burns with war, Sweden teeters on the edge of collapse. King Gustav IV Adolf faces threats from every direction. Russia has torn away Finland, advancing towards Stockholm. To the west, Denmark, Napoleon's ally, threatens invasion. But the deadliest danger lies within his own court. Once loyal advisors, disillusioned by the king's decisions, plot his downfall. A conspiracy brews, one that will forever change the course of Swedish history. In the years leading up to 1809, the storm of war raged across Europe, fueled by Napoleon's ambition to dominate the continent. Nations formed coalition to resist him, and one by one they fell. For Sweden, the war seemed distant at first, but King Gustav IV Adolf couldn't ignore the shifting tides forever. In 1805, Gustav Adolf made a fateful decision. Despite his nation's precarious position, he joined the Third Coalition against Napoleon, siding with Great Britain, Austria, Russia, and Naples. His ambition was clear. Sweden would play its part, and the king promised to lead a 30,000-strong army into Swedish Pomerania in northern Germany. But this move would come to a steep price. Sweden's involvement in the war became a little more than a game of troop movements, with few significant engagements. Then, in the swift campaign and the battles of Ulm and Austerlitz, Napoleon shattered the coalition. By the time Austria and France signed the Treaty of Pressburg in December 1806, Russia, Britain, and Sweden stood alone, increasingly isolated as its allies fell away. Napoleon's dominance was becoming undeniable. In October 1806, as Prussia declared war on France and joined the Fourth Coalition, Napoleon crushed their forces in a matter of days. The Battle of Jena and Auerstadt sealed Prussia's defeat, and soon after, French forces captured Berlin. Yet, even as the tide turned against him, King Gustav Adolf rejected Napoleon's peace offer. His hatred for Napoleon, some said, blinded him to reality. Defeat after defeat took its toll on Sweden. But in April 1807, the Swedish army managed to defend Stralsund and push the French out of Pomerania. But by August 1807, the French, under Marshal Brune, invaded again, and this time Stralsund fell. The loss of Stralsund was a bitter blow. Napoleon had now solidified his hold on northern Germany. By this point, Russia and Prussia had surrendered, signing the Treaty of Tilsit with France. Sweden's allies were falling, and soon it seemed Sweden itself might be next. Inside the Swedish court, discontent grew among officials and ministers. Gustav Adolf's refusal to negotiate, his determination to fight on, and insisting on personally leading his army left his officers frustrated. Some began to admire Napoleon's genius, wondering if peace was the only path forward. But Gustav Adolf, clinging to his ideals and inspired by the memory of his hero Charles XII, refused to budge. He armed himself with Charles XII's sword and pistols, and vowed to continue leading his forces directly. For the king, a defeat at Napoleon's hands could mean losing his throne, as had happened to other European monarchs during this turbulent period. But to many, it wasn't bravery they saw in their king, it was madness. Rumors spread through Sweden's military and civil ranks, comparing Gustav to the unstable George III of England. The whispers of the king's mental instability grew louder with each defeat, each misstep. And with Napoleon's forces growing stronger, many feared what might come next for Sweden. To understand the discontent within Sweden, we must look back to the reign of Gustav III, Gustav Adolf's father. Gustav III had tried to break the power of the nobility through a radical move, summoning the parliament known as the Riksdag in Swedish in 1789. With the support of the lower estates, he passed the Act of Union and Security, granting himself almost absolute power, but with limitation on lawmaking, taxation, and justice. The nobility, however, never forgave him. 2 years later, in 1792, a group of officers and reform-minded nobles conspired to murder Gustav III. He was shot during a masked ball at the opera and died soon after. His son, Gustav Adolf, was only 12 years old. The murder of his father would haunt Gustav Adolf throughout his life, shaping his rule in profound ways. Following Gustav III's assassination, a regency was formed under Duke Karl, Gustav Adolf's uncle. This regency was a fractured body, composed of those same conspirators who had plotted Gustav III's murder. For 4 years, chaos reigned as rival factions vied for control. At the age of 17, Gustav Adolf ascended to a throne burdened by division. Though he wielded absolute power, his kingdom was divided between loyalists to his father's memory and those who had sought to break the monarchy's grip. In theory, he ruled through advisors, but in reality, his court was rife with corruption, betrayal, and ambition. His advisors were power-hungry and self-serving, their loyalty weak. Though Sweden faced growing external threats, the most dangerous enemies were those closest to the king. Gustav Adolf knew neither the state of his army nor the economic hardships of his people, completely unaware that his advisors were manipulating reports to keep him in the dark. Tired of this, the king would disguise himself and venture into the market to discover bread prices for himself. Externally, Gustav Adolf's reign was marked by economic turmoil. Revolutionary France's war with England and Austria disrupted Sweden's foreign trade, weakening its economy. This crisis worsened with repeated crop failures from 1798 to 1800 and a failed currency reform, which further eroded public trust in the monarchy. In a desperate move, Gustav Adolf convened the parliament in Norrköping in 1800, hoping to address Sweden's growing financial instability. Though some reforms were passed, they weren't enough to quell the rising tide of opposition. The nobility, fiercely opposed to his reforms, further distanced themselves from the king. While Gustav Adolf's attempts to reduce court expenses won him some favor with the common people, the bourgeoisie and the clergy, they fueled resentment among nobles, who began to openly undermine his rule. Wachtmeister, the Minister of Law, soon emerged as the king's most vocal critic. He had served under Gustav III and saw himself as a guardian of law and justice, often positioning himself in direct opposition to the king. Wachtmeister organized a faction within the court to resist the king's tax increases and other reforms, slowly chipping away at Gustav Adolf's authority. At the same time, Gustav Adolf's staunch anti-Napoleonic stance strained his foreign relations. The king imposed strict censorship in the Swedish press, even going so far as to demand that Napoleon be referred to only as Monsieur Bonaparte. This alienated the Francophile Swedish upper class and further isolated the king from his own people. Despite these internal pressures, Sweden's military was still believed to be strong at the start of 1808. However, as tension with Russia grew, Gustav Adolf prepared for the worst. He appointed General Klingspor to lead a commission to prepare for an invasion. But even here, opposition within his ranks slowed progress. Reports were manipulated, and the king was led to believe that the Finnish defenses were in a better shape than they truly were. On February the 22nd, 1808, Russia launched a surprise attack, beginning the war that would mark the end of an era for Sweden. The Swedish forces began a strategic withdrawal, hoping to regroup and counterattack, but the retreat dragged on, and by April, Russia had seized southern Finland without much resistance. Only the fortress of Sveaborg held out, a beacon of hope for Sweden. Soon, to the west, Denmark, Norway, backed by a French army stationed in Copenhagen, had declared war and was poised to invade southern Sweden. Yet, disaster struck. On May the 6th, 1808, Sveaborg, often called the Gibraltar of the North, surrendered to Russian forces. Despite being well stocked and heavily armed, housing the entire archipelago fleet. Despite the commander's orders to hold the fortress at all costs until the Swedish offensive could reach and relieve it, the fortress fell. Yet, for reasons that remain unclear, the commander agreed to surrender Sveaborg. The loss was devastating. But everything was not lost. The Swedish army managed a brief resurgence, launching counterattacks that brought several victories, such as Virtebro and Lappo. For a moment, hope seemed to return, but it was short-lived. Russian reinforcements arrived, and by the end of August, Sweden's forces were in full retreat again, even driven across the Kemi River, which marked the border between Finland and Sweden. The loss of Finland, a territory Sweden had held for centuries, was a blow from which the kingdom would never fully recover. Inside the king's court, Gustav Adolf's grip on power was slipping. General Klingsborg, whom the king had once trusted, now seemed more like an enemy. The king saw betrayal at every turn. His officers, his ministers, even his advisors seemed complicit in his failures. Gustav Adolf resolved to rely on no one but himself. But his decisions only made things worse. As the war dragged on, Sweden's economy crumbled. The king attempted to raise taxes without parliamentary approval, but this was met with fierce resistance. Wachtmeister, now leading the opposition, used every tool at his disposal to block the king's efforts. The finance minister, Lagerheim, went further, even sending reports to Russia, painting a grim picture of Sweden's finances. Worse still, Lagerheim spread rumors about the king's sanity, openly calling him mad. In 1809, the king appointed a new commission to assess the economic feasibility of continuing the war. This commission was led by Wachtmeister, whose primary objective was to pressure the king into convening the parliament. Wachtmeister planned to use the parliament to force the king to negotiate peace, but Gustav Adolf was determined to continue the war and wanted to avoid calling the parliament at all costs. Wachtmeister and other officials informed the king that the kingdom's finances were depleted and could not support a prolonged war. The commission's calculations were deliberately inaccurate. The king, growing impatient, reportedly retorted, "I have never heard of such foolish calculations as those made nowadays. In any case, there are resources in this country, but there is simply a lack of goodwill." Wachtmeister, however, reminded him that new taxes could only be levied with the parliament's approval. Frustrated by this opposition, the king established yet another commission, excluding Wachtmeister this time. However, the officials in the new committee continued their passive resistance, doing everything in their power to delay the process. Each official reiterated what Wachtmeister had said earlier. Without the parliament, no new financial measures could be implemented. Eventually, the king, weary of the resistance, dissolved the commission, deciding to manage the economy on his own. Yet even as his court turned against him, the common people remained loyal. Many Swedes still saw Gustav Adolf as a symbol of their nation's unity. They willingly contributed resources to the war effort. offering food, supplies, and labor to support their country. But whispers of conspiracy had begun to spread. Rumors reached the king that the members of his own court were plotting to assassinate him. His paranoia grew. His outbursts of rage became more frequent, his actions more erratic. Gustav Adolf, the man who once wielded absolute power, was now losing control over his kingdom. The stage was set. The first plans to overthrow the king were already being whispered. As early as 1807, whispers of a coup began to stir among the Swedish officers stationed in Pomerania. At first, these were nothing more than disgruntled complaints about King Gustav Adolf's handling of the disastrous war against Napoleon. Many of these officers admired the French emperor and questioned Gustav Adolf's decisions. But as the Finnish war raged on, this dissatisfaction deepened, morphing into something far more dangerous. When the king took command from his headquarters on Åland, frustration boiled over. The spark that set everything ablaze came on October 12, 1808. The king made a decision to demote several guard regiments for retreating during amphibious operations in southern Finland. The king justified his decision with words that cut deep. They have failed in their unconditional duty to hold off the enemy with vigorous resistance. This move enraged the entire officer corps. The guards officers believed that they had been unjustly punished. The officers saw this as more than punishment. It was an attack on their honor. Many of the now demoted officers had not even taken part in the amphibious operations. They argued that they hadn't been given a fair trial, and the entire officer corps believed that this demotion was an insult to all Swedish officers. Some demanded a court-martial, but the king's decision stood. Fuming with resentment, the officers on Åland made a chilling vow to defend and avenge their royal banners, even if it meant killing the king. For days, they hovered around the royal headquarters, paralyzed by indecision. They had the resolve, yet no one had the courage to pull the trigger. As fate would have it, just as one of them finally agreed to take the deed upon himself, the king departed, heading for Stockholm, unaware of how close he had come to death. As Gustav Adolf made his way to Stockholm, he received a letter from Lieutenant Jacob Cederström, a 27-year-old officer whom the king had held in high regard as a man who had earned the king's respect for his leadership in the Finnish war. He had now lost a leg in the battle at the Norwegian border. His loyalty had recently been shaken. In this letter, he expressed his anger at being demoted for dishonorable conduct in a battle he had not even participated in. His bold words challenged the king's decision outright. Upon receiving the letter, Gustav Adolf ordered his uncle to caution Cederström, but also summoned him to Stockholm Palace. During their meeting, the king offered him a post training the 3rd Ranger Battalion. Cederström refused, stating he would accept only if he could serve in the Svea Lifeguards. The king coldly replied, "The Svea Lifeguards no longer exists." Cederström then left the meeting. What the king did not know was that Cederström, like many others, believed that Sweden's true problem was not the military, not the system, but the king himself. No salvation for Sweden could be found as long as Gustav Adolf remained king, he wrote. Following this audience with the king, Cederström met several officers dissatisfied with the demotion of the regiments. Soon his home became a hub for conspiracy, spreading rumors that the king's decisions would ultimately lead to Sweden's ruin. The conspiracy grew rapidly. Officers from all over the country aligned with Cederström's cause. Everywhere, whispers of the king's madness and Sweden's looming collapse echoed in military circles. Cederström had access to detail information about the state of military units nationwide, gathering intelligence from visiting officers who returned to their regiments spreading rumors about the king's dangerous decisions. Soon, the king's opponents of the 1800 parliament joined the growing conspiracy. It was during this time that several key figures became part of the plot. Hans Järta. Hans Järta initially pursued a military career before attending university, where he earned a degree in law. He had initially been a supporter of Gustav III, but grew increasingly critical of the monarch's autocratic tendencies. He was present at the infamous masked ball when the king was assassinated. After Gustav Adolf took power and implemented reforms, Järta protested and left his position at the court, and instead began working as a lawyer. He would be one of the coup's main architects, convinced that only drastic change could save Sweden. Colonel Anders Sköldebrand, a former adjutant to Duke Karl, had retired from any official position to pursue art and writing. But with the Finnish War breaking out, Sköldebrand rejoined the military and was soon drawn into the conspiracy. His influence would prove critical. Georg Adelsparre, a man of humble manners but fierce intelligence and a man of action rather than words. He had opposed the king since the 1800 parliament. While lacking the refined polish of his aristocratic peers, Adelsparre was seen by many as the revolution's potential savior, a man ready to lead the Western Army to Stockholm. When Cederström contacted him through a mutual officer, Adelsparre was enthusiastic. He believed the revolution was not only inevitable, it was necessary. In the last months of 1808 and the beginning of 1809, Gustav Adolf clashed repeatedly with his officials. Wachtmeister continued the resistance, constantly reminding the king that Sweden's finances were crumbling. Wachtmeister seized every opportunity to pressure the king into convening the parliament, but Gustav Adolf refused. The king pushed through a new tax, but this proved the breaking point. Officials now openly opposed him, and Adelsparre's preparations for the revolution accelerated. By the end of 1808, the conspiracy was fully formed, with factions across the Swedish military. In every corner of the army, officers talked of revolution. Within Cederström's growing circle, the plans to depose Gustav Adolf took shape. The goal was simple: remove the king and his dynasty. Duke Karl would serve as regent until a suitable replacement could be found. Cederström himself dreamed of a Sweden led by a strong military commander, one who could lead the kingdom to victory against its enemies. Järta played a pivotal role in these discussions. He began drafting a provisional government plan based on the 1772 constitution, but with amendments, the conspirators weren't looking to turn back the clock. They wanted a new Sweden. United, their belief that Sweden would not survive unless action was taken. The coup, they argued, was not treason, it was a patriotic duty. Despite the growing momentum, the conspirators lacked a crucial figure, a leader who could unite the military and lead the revolution. Several generals were approached, but most refused, citing a promise they had made to Gustav III on his deathbed to support his son no matter what. Even so, these generals kept the king completely in the dark. Their search for a leader finally ended with Carl Johan Adlercreutz, a seasoned military officer. Adlercreutz had gained recognition for his leadership during the Finnish War, but it also had left him pessimistic toward the war effort. Upon arriving in Stockholm in early January 1809, he was hailed as a war hero, though this was largely due to exaggerated propaganda. Cederström's conspirators saw him as their best hope. Järta tried to persuade him to join, seeing him as the only man capable of maintaining government and law after the revolution. But Adlercreutz hesitated. He expressed doubts about his suitability for leadership, stating that while he was a capable military tactician, he lacked the ability to govern a country. Still, the conspirators were persistent. They believed He was the key to success. On February the 5th, 1809, frustrated by Adalkraut's indecision, the conspirators decided to act. They planned to ambush the king on February the 8th, when he would pass by an inn on his way home to Haga Palace, with only 5 soldiers escorting him. The plan was simple: lock the royal carriage, seize the king, and take him into custody. Duke Karl would assume the role of regent, but Jetta objected. Worried that the premature action could spark a civil war, he insisted that government officials be involved before moving forward. Sköldebrand and Jetta compromised, agreeing to wait until the officials and ministers were on board. Despite the agreement, Colonel Sköldebrand moved forward with the plan. On February the 8th, 1809, the conspirators gathered at Cederström's house, preparing to execute the plot. But when Sköldebrand arrived, he discovered nothing had been arranged. The hired wagon and the horses were missing. As tension mounted, Jetta arrived and, to everyone's surprise, threatened to expose the plan to the king unless they backed down. After a heated debate, reluctantly the coup was called off, at least for the time being. Shortly after this failure, Adalkraut finally stepped forward. He revised the plan. The king would now be arrested at Haga Palace itself. This time, they would wait for Adalsparre, who was preparing the Western Army for a march on Stockholm. Once the signal was received, the king would be arrested at Haga Palace. By March the 5th, 1809, Adalsparre had reached a point of no return. He asked his soldiers if they were ready to march on Stockholm to save the fatherland, and they eagerly agreed, believing they were simply pushing for the parliament to be convened, not realizing they were marching toward revolution. The king was still unaware that the ground beneath him was slipping. What followed would not only change the course of Swedish history, but would forever alter the balance of power in Northern Europe. On March the 7th, Cederström received a letter from Adalsparre. The revolution had begun. Early in the morning of March the 7th, 1809, Jacob Cederström received Adalsparre's letter. Inside, along with the news of the army's movement, were copies of the revolutionary proclamation, ready to be spread across Stockholm. It was now up to the conspirators in the capital to ensure the king's capture. Without wasting time, Jetta spread the word to key officials, including Finance Minister Lagerheim, Secretary of State Lagerbring, and Wachtmeister. But secrets have a way of slipping out. Rumors of Adalsparre's advance began to circulate, reaching a lively social club in Stockholm. There, a Frenchman named André de Rodet discussed the chatter with his friend General Kurt von Steding. Concerned, they rushed to alert the king's loyal servant, Governor of Ugglas, a man the conspirators had previously failed to win over. True to form of Ugglas, he remained steadfastly loyal to Gustav Adolf. By 7 p.m., Av Ugglas had sent men to Örebro to confirm the rumors. He also sent von Steding with a letter to Haga to inform the king of the Western Army's movements. Later that night, the king read Av Ugglas' letter. His reaction was swift. Orders were given to prepare his horses and assemble the guards for an escort to Stockholm Palace. Observant bystanders would have noticed the sudden urgency of the royal stablemaster Roland that rode towards Stockholm, directly to Cederström's residence. Meanwhile, as von Steding rode toward Haga, the conspirators gathered at Cederström's residence, armed with a squadron of the Life Regiment's dragoons. They were preparing to ride out and arrest the king by 10 p.m., but their plans were interrupted by Roland's sudden arrival. "The king is hot on my heels," he blurted out. In an instant, the conspirators scattered. Only Cederström and Jetta remained, and from their hiding spot, they saw the king's entourage making its way toward Stockholm Palace. The king arrived at the palace in the flickering light of torches. His sudden appearance took Duke Karl and his confidant the Sermain, by surprise. Inside the palace, the king summoned von Stedink and the Roder for questioning, demanding to know the origin of the rumors about the Western Army. The Roder deflected, claiming he couldn't recall who said what at the club, only vaguely mentioning a man whose name might have been Silver. Determined to find the truth, the king sent someone to the club to retrieve a list of recent guests. An hour later, an officer knocked at Cederström's door. He warned that the king was planning arrests in Stockholm. Gerta hurriedly left. At 1 a.m., Gerta returned, having visited Secretary of State Lagerbring and Adlercreutz. He warned that arrests were imminent, with Cederström likely the first target. Gerta voiced his fear that the entire conspiracy might be exposed. After he left, Lagerbring rushed to Stockholm Palace in a desperate attempt to halt the arrests. But the king wasn't interested. His focus was fixed on unmasking the source of the Western Army rumors. Throughout the night, the king deliberated over which troops to deploy against the rebel forces. He then received a guest list from the club, about 50 names, all summoned for interrogation. The questioning would last well into the following day. The king remained in Stockholm Palace until 3 a.m. on March the 9th, before returning to Haga Palace. As Gerta and Cederström braced for the worst, the king's interrogation picked up pace. Members of the social club were questioned one after the other, but the conspirators' careful planning paid off. None of the interrogated individuals revealed anything. Each one feigned ignorance, lied, or gave conflicting statements. The name Silver cropped up repeatedly, but it was too vague. There were at least 15 people in Stockholm with that prefix, frustrating the king's effort to pin down the source. Everyone had played their part perfectly. The interrogations, while rigorous, proved ineffective. The conduct of the interrogations was questionable, as officials seemed to be merely executing the king's orders and nothing more. By March the 11th, the king had received reports from Karlstad confirming that the Western Army had not, in fact, advanced towards Stockholm. Furious, the king began to suspect that the rumors were a deliberate ploy to intimidate him. On March the 11th, the king took matters into his own hands, personally interrogating suspects. His frustration boiled over. One witness overheard him shouting at his interrogator, "I do not wish to know if it's this or that. He must remember what he does. What the hell kind of tricks are these? He must, damn it, remember when I order he must, or he must confess he is useless." But the king was slowly starting to question the truth to the rumor. No reports from officials indicated any military movement towards Stockholm. It was beginning to seem absurd. Could a rebellion really be brewing in Värmland? The king was now convinced that the rumor was likely false. After the final interrogation, he returned to Haga Palace to spend Sunday, March the 12th, with his family. But the rumors lingered in his mind. On March the 12th, a messenger arrived in Stockholm, bearing a letter addressed to Secretary of State Lagerbring. The first expedition secretary, uncertain on which side to take, hesitated. If he gave the letter to Lagerbring, the conspirators would intercept it, and the king would never see it. In the end, he decided to deliver it to Av Ugglas. Av Ugglas received the letter and sent it immediately to the king, who was still at Haga Palace. The contents were explosive. Örebro had fallen to the revolutionaries. The rumor was true. The king read the letter around noon. His response was swift. He summoned Av Melin and declared that the Western Army's march was not just a rumor. Messengers were sent back to Stockholm to assemble the magistrates and citizens at 5 p.m. in the town hall. Orders went out to close the city gates and fortify the guards. No one would be allowed to leave, and anyone entering would face strict questioning and search. Troops from the Life Regiment were called up to the palace. Av Melin was sent ahead to the palace to await the king's arrival. At 3 p.m., the king left Haga and headed for Stockholm. The royal family was placed under the protection of Axel von Fersen. Upon his arrival at 4 p.m., The king immediately issued orders. Troops were stationed at key points, artillery placed at the western gate, and all the soldiers were called to duty. The city was ready for a siege. The king began to doubt his uncle, Duke Karl, questioning his loyalty. He summoned the duke, who evaded direct questions about his allegiance. What exactly was discussed is unknown, but we know the king read Adelspar's proclamation and questioned whether the conspirators had attempted to contact the duke. The duke, however, evaded the question. The king ordered officials to gather. Many were loyal, like Av Uglas and Av Melin, but others had been conspiring against him for 2 years. They made one final attempt to convince the king to summon parliament. Again, he refused. Instead, he announced his intention to remain in Stockholm, gather his troops and confront Adelspar's rebel army head-on. A proclamation was to be published, countering the revolutionaries. As the day dragged on, the king developed a new plan. At midnight, he ordered that the Queen's Life Guards and a squadron of cuirassiers, along with 4 cannons, prepare to march towards Södertälje. The royal family would be escorted there the next morning. The king would join them before continuing south. Together with the national treasury and all available troops, the king would march toward the loyal South Army. Stockholm's defense was entrusted to 1,800 men from the citizen guards. The king needed funds urgently. He summoned Fabian von Fashion, the governor of the Bank of Sweden, demanding 2 million riksdaler to finance his journey south and that the treasury would also follow south. Von Fashion refused, explaining that only Parliament had the authority to release such funds. Despite the king's demand, von Fashion remained steadfast. Von Fashion insisted that the king must submit the correct application to convene the bank's board so they could consider the king's request. At 7 a.m., the bank's board officially rejected the king's request, possibly the only time in history a man refused an absolute monarch on a technicality. By the evening of March the 12th, Adlercreutz attended a ball, blissfully unaware of the city's growing tension. When he left just before midnight, he realized that the king had received the letter and that they needed to act fast. Through the night of March the 13th, Adlercreutz sent out urgent messages, summoning all conspirators to his residence by 7 a.m. Trusted colleagues and officers were to gather at Stockholm Palace at 8 a.m. for a show of loyalty. The conspirators was well informed about what had happened at the palace during the night. Every royal order was being reported to the conspirators. Finance Minister Lagerheim informed them about the king's demands on the Bank of Sweden and urged him to arrest the king as soon as possible. A colonel reported his orders to prepare his cuirassier regiment for departure in the morning. More arrived during the night with messages, such as the Semaine. Adlercreutz ordered him to persuade Duke Karl to take the lead in the new government. Around 6 a.m., Jette arrived to inform that the king would leave at any moment. Adlercreutz then went to Wachtmeister, who urged him to arrest the king and that the conspirators now had the support of most officials to arrest the king. In the morning hours, a message arrived from the king. Adlercreutz was to report for a meeting with the king at 8 a.m. By early morning, many had gathered at Adlercreutz's home. Just before 7 a.m., Adlercreutz, along with an officer, got into a carriage. First, they went to Av Uglas. Adlercreutz declared what they planned to do that morning. Av Uglas replied that he remained loyal to the king. Adlercreutz then extended his hand to Av Uglas and said, "Well, each to his own, and we are equally honest nonetheless." Av Uglas then went to the king to persuade him to stay in Stockholm, while Adlercreutz picked up Klingspor to enter the castle together. Around 7:30 a.m., they arrived at the palace. In the Pillar Hall, most of those Adlercreutz had ordered to attend were there. General Klingspor then went up the stairs towards the king's rooms, while Adlercreutz informed those who were not aware that they would arrest the king. The conspirators believed that the king was guarded by a force of 4 lifeguards, but in reality they were 20. Nonetheless, they knew the time to strike had come. 8 a.m. Duke Karl stormed out of the king's bedroom. Gustav Adolf had just spoken with his uncle for the last time. The conversation had not gone smoothly. Both men had a fiery temperament, and the discussion ended in a heated dispute. The Duke had refused to accompany the king to Skåne to fight the rebels, and had also advised the king against leaving. After the Duke's departure, silence fell over the king's bedroom. He was tired and had not slept much during the night. The king slowly walked to the window overlooking the courtyard and looked out. He summoned Av Melin to the room. While waiting for him, the king saw a group of officers gathered in the courtyard. Concern turned to anxiety. What was this large group of officers doing here? Adlercreutz ordered the other officers to wait in the pillar hall, while he and General Klingspor went up a staircase to the next floor where the king's bedroom was located. The two men entered the anteroom to the king's bedroom, where other officials and soldiers were waiting. On his way out from the king's office, Av Uglas met the conspirators. Av Uglas realized what was happening and urged Adlercreutz to act with caution. He did not want to be present at the king's arrest and left in silence. The king immediately called for Klingspor, while Adlercreutz had to wait. However, the wait was not long. The conversation inside the king's bedroom had escalated, and soon the exchange was nothing but raised voices in agitation. Klingspor had tried to persuade the king to stay in Stockholm and to convene the parliament, but to no avail. Outside the bedroom, Adlercreutz heard Klingspor loudly deny the king's departure. "Your Majesty will not be leaving." This was the agreed phrase that signaled the start of the action. Adlercreutz summoned a numerous group of officers waiting one floor below. However, only 6 soldiers showed up. No others dared to come. Adlercreutz was surprised and said, "Aren't there more of you, gentlemen?" But he quickly composed himself and ordered the officers to follow him. Adlercreutz marched decisively toward the door to the king's bedroom. Inside, the king stood looking shocked at a group of men now flooding into the room. Adlercreutz approached the king and said, "The kingdom's unfortunate situation is a matter of general concern, further heightened by your Majesty's intention to leave. All high officials, military officers, and the foremost citizens have sworn me to prevent this, and we are here to do just that." The king acted quickly, drawing his sword and loudly declaring that this was treason, and that anyone threatening him would meet an unfortunate end if they continued. Adlercreutz moved toward the king to restrain him. Adlercreutz, along with an officer, tackled the king, who began shouting for help and claiming they were murdering him. The officer wrested the sword from the king, while Adlercreutz held him down. But Gustav Adolf did not give up easily. He fought bravely, managing to strike the officer and causing the sword he held to fly up into the ceiling and hit the chandelier. It fell to the floor and shattered. The conspirators then wrestled him down and put him in a chair. All the while the king screamed, "They want to murder me! Help!" The conspirators grew even more nervous. They struggled to hold the king, who was kicking wildly. Another officer slapped the king several times and grabbed his hair. The king grew angrier. But then the officer pressed him against the wall with a chokehold, telling the king to be quiet or he will be the first victim of the revolution. Adlercreutz took the officer by the arm and said the king was a sacred person who should not be mistreated. The king's loud cries attracted unwanted attention. Officers heard the cries for help and came to the king's aid and began banging on the door. They started using their swords to break down the door. The conspirators became nervous as their plan was starting to unravel. Adlercreutz decided to open the doors. He told the officers that the king was unharmed and urged them to calm down. However, Av Melin demanded they must protect the king, as he struck the door loudly with his command staff. When the king saw Av Melin through the door, he called for help, which distracted Av Melin enough for Adlercreutz to grab his command staff and declared that he was now in command. He ordered all the guards and other attendants to withdraw, or he would personally shoot the first person who attempted to free the king. But then the rumble of the 20 lifeguards was heard. When the lifeguards entered the anteroom, Adlercreutz asked them what they wanted and said everything was in order. He raised the command staff and ordered them to withdraw, which they did after some hesitation. The doors were closed. The king sat in a chair in the room, and it was all over. He became calmer when he realized they did not intend to kill him. Av Uglas returned and tried to calm the king and urged him to convene the parliament. The king brusquely dismissed him and shouted at him. Af Ugglas left the room but soon returned with General Klingspool. Af Ugglas tried again to explain convening the parliament was the only possible chance for the king to keep his crown. The king responded simply, "Give me my sword back and we shall talk more about this." Klingspool left the room. Adolf also went to inform the rest of the army in Stockholm that the king had been captured and was under arrest. Left in the room were only the king, 3 officers and Af Ugglas. The king berated 2 officers for their poor attire and they left the room at the king's orders. What happened next is not clear. The king managed to take the remaining officer's sword and began defending himself again. However, he soon heard footsteps and voices outside his bedroom. Adolf and the others were coming back. Now, time was of the essence, and action had to be swift. The king knew the palace better than anyone present. In the room was a secret door leading to the queen's apartments, which the king quickly opened and closed, just as Adolf and the others entered the bedroom. The king locked the door and ran up the spiral staircase. Behind the closed door, the king could hear Adolf shouting loudly, "The king has escaped! Run, capture him!" Adolf and the others threw themselves at the door, managed to break it open and began chasing the king up the stairs. The king threw a large bunch of keys at the conspirators. Adolf stumbled on the stairs as he dodged a flying object and slid down the steps. Gustav Adolf ran through the queen's apartments and locked the doors behind him. He created a distance between himself and the aging Adolf, who could not keep up the pace. The king managed to descend the staircase and reach the northern end of the palace. He fell on the stairs and injured his right arm, but got up and started running again. There was no possible escape route from there, so he had to run across the courtyard to the western gate to get out. On the outer courtyard were 1,200 loyal troops from Pomerania, who would undoubtedly defend the king against all threats. The king ran across the courtyard, but was spotted by 2 conspirators. One of the conspirators became frightened and retreated when the king began raising his sword against him. The remaining conspirator was gamekeeper von Greif. He was large and strong, parrying the king's attacks with his sword and grabbing the king by the waist. This strange spectacle unfolding in the courtyard was observed by a wood carrier, Bergman, and others working at the palace. Bergman shouted to his colleagues, "The king is being attacked! Come, we shall defend our king!" Bergman attacked von Greif with a piece of wood, but soon Adolf and the other conspirators arrived, panting, and told everyone in the courtyard that the king was ill and needed help to be captured. Wood carrier Bergman was chased away by the other conspirators, but was probably one of the few who actually tried to defend the king that day. The king fought fiercely and refused to give up. It took 4 men to restrain him. After this struggle, he was completely exhausted, covered in blood. He felt nauseated and was on the brink of vomiting. The conspirators carried him back inside the palace to place him under arrest. But then came one final, golden opportunity for the king to free himself from his enemies. He spotted a sentry post with soldiers from the Pomeranian regiment and shouted to them, "Fire and follow me." The soldiers raised their muskets toward the conspirators. Von Greif shouted to the soldiers that the king was ill and that they should open the palace doors. The soldiers, following the command, lowered their muskets and opened the doors, saluting as the conspirators carried the king past them. They took the king up to the White Room on the queen's floor. They placed him in a chair and he immediately vomited on the floor. The king then spoke very softly. "I die contented, for I die for my country." He remained seated in the chair throughout the day. During this time, the conspirators came by to insult him and mock him, grimaced at the king, and dressed poorly on purpose, knowing that he detested such behavior. This treatment continued until evening, when the king was taken to Drottningholm Palace. The coup of 1809 effectively ended the Gustavian era. Duke Karl was chosen as a new monarch, ascending the throne as Karl XIII. At 61 years old, and with no legitimate heirs, Karl XIII was considered a transitional figure. The political elite, wanting to prevent the return of autocratic rule, introduced the Constitution of 1809 that limited the powers of the king and established a balance between the monarchy and the parliament. This constitution is considered one of the foundation of modern Swedish democracy, remaining in effect with modification until 1974. After the overthrow of Gustav Adolf, Cederström continued his service after the revolution. While his direct political influence waned, Cederström maintained his military career, ultimately achieving the rank of lieutenant colonel. He played a more passive role in the aftermath, focusing on his military duties rather than seeking political power. Cederström's legacy is less well known than some of his revolutionary counterparts, but his role in maintaining order during the coup and advocating for parliamentary authority helped shape Sweden's transition into a constitutional monarchy. Adolf became a member of the new government and played a key role in drafting the new constitution. Despite his significant contributions, Adolf did not seek personal power and eventually withdrew from the political scene, feeling sidelined by the new regime. After the coup, Adolf was appointed Minister of War. Adolf played a crucial role in maintaining stability and ensuring that the transition to a new constitutional framework was successful. He remained a prominent figure in Swedish politics, helping to navigate the country through this period of change. Jetta was a strong advocate for limiting the powers of the monarchy, and he is one of the principal authors of the 1809 constitution. His contributions were vital in shaping Sweden's new political order, ensuring a more balanced distribution of power between the monarchy and the parliament. After the coup, Jetta continued to be an influential political thinker, although he gradually distanced himself from active politics. Sköldebrand was also involved in the subsequent restructuring of the government. Sköldebrand supported the constitutional reforms and played a key role in the discussion that led to adoption of the 1809 constitution. He was later appointed Minister of the Navy, contributing to the rebuilding of Sweden's naval forces after the losses suffered during the Napoleonic Wars. With Karl XIII childless and Sweden in need of a stable and competent leadership, the parliament decided to adopt a foreign prince as the heir to the throne. The choice fell on Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, a marshal of France under Napoleon. He took the name of Karl XIV Johan. His reign marked the beginning of the Bernadotte dynasty, which still reigns in Sweden today. After his forced abdication, Gustav Adolf was held in custody for several months. In December 1809, Gustav Adolf was sent in exile with his family. His life in exile was marked by personal and financial difficulties. He never regained political power and became increasingly isolated, even losing contact with his family. He unsuccessfully attempted to regain the throne during the Congress of Vienna in 1815, where he argued for his restoration as the legitimate king of Sweden, but his claims were ignored. Gustav Adolf spent his later years moving between different countries in Europe. He adopted the name Colonel Gustafsson. He eventually settled in Switzerland, where he lived in relative obscurity until his death in 1837. He was buried in the city of St. Gallen, and his remains were later transferred to Stockholm in 1884. Despite his tragic downfall, Gustav Adolf remained steadfast in his belief that his policies had been in Sweden's best interest, even as his legacy was overshadowed by the reforms that followed his reign. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to stay updated on our latest uploads.